Hello, let's talk about Cloud Wars, and we're going to focus on AWS versus Azure. There certainly are a lot of other cloud providers out there, but these are the two big names, and I'm going to try to evaluate both of them for you. Before we get started, my name is Paul Oliver. I am the Principal Software Architect at Mosaic. That's my Twitter handle there. It's Paultastic. Mosaic unlocks insights with video. So if you can imagine a classroom where students are filmed and teachers and other students can give feedback in real time, and then allow the student to focus only on the moments where they have to learn something. That's what we do at Mosaic. My experience with both Azure and AWS is, I think fairly rich. I've used 14 months of Azure when I was at Idea5 as the director of application development, where I was in charge of architecture for the web side. Used lots of technologies from VMs all the way down to Redis and their Azure Search and Azure websites. On the AWS side, for my last 9 months here at Mosaic, been using a lot of Amazon technology, so EC2 all the way down to CloudWatch. So I have extensive experience in both, and I feel that I'm qualified to at least sort of compare the two. Now, how will I compare them? That's a good question. There's so much they offer. Although I've used a lot of Azure and AWS services, I've only scratched the surface in a lot of areas. I just haven't been able to try every single thing that they offer, that either service offers. So, but before I started even thinking about how I would compare the two and where I would rank them, I decided the top 10 things for me, the things that are important to me when evaluating a cloud service provider, would be these 10 things. And I think I'll probably capture at least 3 of your top 5 in these 10, I think, somewhere, hopefully. And let's dive right in. So as far as compute instances, this is by far the largest cost from Idea5, from Mosaic, and then also Mosaic is affiliated with Huddle, so I have great access to their infrastructure engineers, and their compute is also their highest cost. So this is going to be round one. This is very important. So comparing the two, AWS has EC2, Elastic Compute, and then Azure's called VMs. But there are 54 AWS instance types to 52 on Azure side. And an instance type is a configuration like how many cores that you have on your VM and then how much RAM. So there are 54 versus 52, very similar. As far as image choices, you have a marketplace in both Amazon's and Microsoft's cloud offering, where you can pick, let's say I want to install, Ubuntu Server 1404 LTS, or maybe Windows Server 2012 R2. Those would be image choices. Maybe they're specific, like this is a Wowza Media Encoder server. So this is what these numbers are. The Azure number was very hard to come by. I had to basically crawl their API to get that number. So that's not published anywhere. AWS just puts it right there on their marketplace. As far as the number of operating systems supported, it's 11 versus 9. That's probably not going to impact you, in case it's just different flavors of Linux probably is the big discrepancy there. And then the number of CPUs that both support, you can put 40 in a VM in Amazon, 32 in Azure. And as far as memory goes, you can put a lot more memory on Azure side, 448 gigs versus 244 on the AWS side. So just to give you an idea, this is what I was talking about as far as image choices. Different, AMIs or, VHDs that you could install in your VM. On the Amazon side, you can see how you would choose like an Amazon RDS or Server 2012 R2. On the Azure side, you can see that their marketplace, you can, choose from the list, and on the right-hand side, you get a description. I'm going to declare this one a tie because you probably don't need 65,000 plus images, and you probably don't need 448 gigs of RAM. You're just not in that area most likely, and so as far as they both go, they're pretty close. I could argue either way which one's better. on the Amazon side, the VMs are a little bigger, so you get a little bit, more capacity, but that's priced in a little bit too. On the Azure side, they have a much slicker interface, I think, as far as that goes. But in the end, I'm going to call it a tie. So I give them both 8 points. As far as storage goes, all right, so this is going to be probably your second highest cost in the cloud. Azure calls it blob storage. Amazon calls it S3. And just jumping right in here, we have AWS pretty much does everything that Azure does and more. They have the REST API. You can do a batch import of a large group of files. Where they start to step apart here or differ, AWS has an auto delete or an archive feature. So you can say after X number of days, after 30 days, I want to go to infrequent access. And then after that, I want you to archive it to Glacier, so it just does that automatically. Azure, you're going to have to manage that yourself. AWS allows you to set up requester pay so that your customers will pay for their storage based on their Amazon account. So that's a nice feature for startups if they need to store massive amounts of data and they just want to pass that cost directly to the consumer. Encrypting data server side, that's already working in AWS. Azure, it's in progress. They're very close to having that shored up. And then reduce redundancy, you can do it both on AWS and Azure, except in AWS, it's at the file by file level if you need it to be. You can also put it at the entire folder or bucket, but in Azure, it's at the storage account level. And then the maximum size of a blob in AWS is 5 terabytes, whereas Azure's 1. And then the security granularity, you can say this entire folder is locked out of the whole world, but hey, this one file I do want to share with the rest of the world or with someone else. You can do that in AWS. You can't do that in Azure. It's set at the bucket at the folder level. So here's a shot of the S3 lifecycle management where this auto delete, auto archive is set up. And this is just on one of our buckets at Mosaic, how this is basically when somebody uploads a video to us. After 90 days, I just take the video and put it in Glacier and just save a lot of money there. And then after 2 years, I'm just going to delete the video permanently. And I don't have to manage this. This is a file-by-file setting. I mean, each file will be managed independently, but I set this at the bucket that they're all uploaded to. And then also multi-part uploads. I just, can decide after 3 days that video is never going to get fully uploaded, so just delete all the other fragments. Nice feature that Azure does not have. So this is going to be one of the areas where AWS really shines. I'm giving it a 9 here for their storage, and then Azure gets 6. All right, databases. All right, so databases is huge for a lot of reasons. You might want a relational, you might want a NoSQL, you might need data warehouse. Both services offer these solutions to you. So jumping in here, AWS supports 6 different database engines as a service, whereas Azure supports 2. That isn't to say you couldn't put Oracle on Azure. You would just have to set up a VM and manage it yourself. AWS allows you to set up an Oracle server, and it will manage, the scaling and the redundancy and backups for you. So that's nice. As far as NoSQL engines, both offer 2 similar styles of NoSQL engines that you can use, in addition to setting up your own Mongo server if you wanted to, for example. You can use SQL Server Management Studio on both if you love that. I'm a .NET developer and a Microsoft shop. Has been where my whole career has been a Microsoft shop. So really like SQL Server Management Studio. Ease of managing SQL Server as a service. I would say this is where Azure shines. They have SQL Server Azure, and it is really, really slick. Super easy to set up. AWS is not that hard to set up either. It's just not as easy as Azure, so I'm giving it a moderate. Same thing for the backup. And then data warehouse as a service, both of them offer it. AWS has Redshift, and Azure has Azure Data Warehouse and Data Lake. Very similar offerings, and AWS is a little more mature there, but Azure's catching up. Here's a kind of an example of AWS RDS. This is their relational database service. And this is how you would select an engine. I was talking about all the different engines they support. Here you can select an Oracle database service, and then you would set up a master username and password and give it an instance class. And then it handles the rest. It handles backups. It handles availability for you. So I'm going to give the edge here to AWS just because you can have access to more databases, database engines, and then their NoSQL offering, DynamoDB. I just like it better in practice. It's more mature. It's got more support across different languages. DocumentDB on paper is superior. It just doesn't have a lot of the tooling support. It doesn't have the integration with SDKs yet, and there's pricing is fairly confusing to me. So, and other developers that have worked with it, it's just kind of a struggle to figure out how to get it using. I just think it needs some maturing. So 8 for AWS, 7 for Amazon. All right, deployment. I'm a big continuous delivery person. I really I'm passionate about making deployment boring. So I love talking about deployment. Both AWS and Azure allow you to use MS Deploy. As a Microsoft software developer, MS Deploy is how I get web packages, delivered. You can use PowerShell. You can you deploy to auto scaling group. You can deploy from Visual Studio, and deploying is easy to moderate depending on both. Where Azure shines is they have this staging production slot where you can hot swap between the two. It's kind of like a red-blue deployment. This is incredibly useful for just setting up a continuous delivery environment where you deploy to a staging slot. You get a unique URL that's only that's nearly impossible to guess. You get this URL, and then you can just plug it in your browser and just try the app before you say, okay, this is ready for production. Then you just use the Azure portal or a PowerShell script, and you can do a swap. And essentially the IP addresses for your old production gets pointed to the staging slot, and the staging slot IP address gets swapped with production. So your user's traffic will just get diverted to your staging slot. It's so simple to set up and so simple to understand. It really makes a continuous delivery sort of setup, almost turnkey. So here's an example of what this looks like. Here is a Azure subscription. These are some cloud services in the classic, but you can see here on the fourth row down, there's two running staging and production slots. And then if we went into this service, you would see a swap button that allows you to swap the two. And it takes a minute or two to get the traffic redirected and everything spun up and everything, but it's that simple. It really is. So I'm going to give the edge here to Azure. Their deployment is dead simple for the typical use case stuff. Outstanding game changers, really. AWS, you can do everything Azure does. You're just going to have to do the work manually to set that up. I will mention at this point, though, that AWS makes hard deployment stuff fairly easy. So it's like once you figure out how to get deployment working, you can do everything from updating your NGINX, web config files or your NGINX configuration files on a Linux box about as simply as you could set up MS deployment as well. So you're going to be able to get more mileage out of the AWS deployment setup because they have this cloud formation. But if you don't really want to mess around with that stuff, you're not thinking you want to mess around with DevOps very much, Azure is the way to go. So Azure gets the win here, 9-7. As far as security goes, if you want to talk about how do you secure your resources in the cloud, or how do you keep the bad guys out, or if you need a contract with a government agency and they require you to follow the requirements of only working with U.S. persons and those sorts of things. This is the section I'm going to talk about next. Really, they're so similar on these. They just deviate a little bit. So I won't go into all the details here, but you can use Active Directory to integrate with AWS and Azure to authenticate and authorize slightly. You can control who can add and remove users in both. This is a new thing for Azure. A year ago, you wouldn't be able to have that fine-grained control. So you wouldn't be able to say that developers can only create VMs, but they can't create databases. You couldn't do that. You basically said you get the keys to the kingdom or you're read-only. So it's nice that last December they turned on role-based access control, where now you can have some more of that control. And that's why I give them a sorta. Their role-based access control is coming along. It's maturing. It's just not. It's based on AWS's IAM, Identity and Access Management, and so I'm glad to see that. It's just not as mature. So giving AWS a little extra, points here. And then as far as a government-friendly cloud region, AWS has Amazon GovCloud, and Azure has Azure Government. Similar style of offerings. The only thing is AWS is a little more mature, and so you get more credit for that. Here's what IAM can look like. It's hard to capture this in a screenshot, but this is, let's say you wanted to create a policy for Amazon S3, the storage service, and you wanted to give just a few particular actions that are possible. And then let's say you wanted to even provide, or here's a DynamoDB policy. This is what the document looks like. It's JSON. And here, these are the actions that are possible for any table in the DynamoDB that starts with a D dash. You can see that on line 21, D dash star. So what this is saying that is this policy, if it's in place, is that somebody that gets this policy can do all of these actions on DynamoDB if the table starts with D dash for my development environment. And you can nest multiple, statements together to get a really fine-grained security policy. So AWS does get the edge here because they've been, doing this for quite a while, and they give you a lot of options. And then, of course, as I was mentioning earlier, a GovCloud, since it is the standard, a lot of government agencies are already familiar with it, and they will not have any problem approving RFPs that use GovCloud. Azure Government is still kind of getting traction. All right, user interface. So this is broader than just their portal. It also includes the CLI, so the command line interface. If you are going to be doing a lot of stuff in the cloud, you're going to want a robust set of tools you can use the command line so that you can work these into your deployment processes. And so just put them up on the board. They are very similar, really, across the board. AWS just has, more mature offerings. Like, for example, the Python and Ruby SDK for Amazon has a lot more power than the Azure Python and Ruby, and it's updated more often, and they keep them in sync. But if your world is PowerShell and just logging into the portal, you're not going to even care about that stuff. So Azure's portal, I really, really like it compared to the AWS console. Here's kind of a screenshot of what you see when you log in, and then you can see all your indexes, and you can see all your resources. And here's like one of the resources. This is Redis caching. You can see a really nice looking graph of your performance, and you can see just how it's performing. It's a nice interface. It feels like it's integrated. It feels like all the resources work together in one cohesive portal. Amazon, you kind of get the sense that different teams build different sections of their portal. So I'm going to give the win here to Azure. There you have a slicker portal. You can do a lot with their SDKs, but the Amazon one's a little more mature. But at the end of the day, you're going to spend a lot of time in the portals or in the AWS console, and you're just going to, I think Azure's is just better. As far as support and community, it's also important to me that, hey, if you're stuck on something, there's a lot of people that you can go to that can give you insights or help. So in as far as the share goes, I mean, Amazon has been around for over 10 years, and Azure, they have a 4-year head start on Azure, so they just have a larger market share. They are the standard by which all cloud service providers are graded. Azure has the 9% share. Amazon basically dwarfs the next three cloud providers combined. It might even be the next five, but it's just that much bigger than all of them. As far as questions on Stack Overflow, Azure has a lot of support, though, a lot of questions, a lot of people out there asking about it. You can get a lot of help out there in the community. Amazon has a lot more conferences a year, 5 to 1, and I say 1-ish because Microsoft Build is like an Azure conference, but it's a lot of other things too. It's Visual Studio, it's .NET, it's those things. So Amazon just has specific AWS conferences, and there's AWS reInvent and AWS Summit and a few others. They have about 180 webinars a year. They spend a lot of time on their webinars. Azure does webinars too, but they're not as many, but hundreds a lot anyway, so I guess that shouldn't be a big deal. And then as far as podcasts and webcasts go, AWS really doesn't spend much effort here. So your Azure spends more on this. And I'm including Azure Fridays on Channel 9. And I will give a ton of credit to Microsoft here. They're spending a lot of work building out a slick learning tool with Azure Fridays. They're funny. They're great. Great people talking on them. So I think Azure Fridays are a home run if you're doing that. But the AWS conferences are incredible. This is just, if you go to the events and webinars page on the AWS site, there's a huge list of different monthly webinar series and global summits, and they are huge. They have a lot of people that go to them, a lot of smart people talking about how they're leveraging the cloud. So top-notch stuff. Either one isn't, you're not going to feel like you're alone on an island. So AWS and Azure both offer great support, great community. Giving the edge here to Amazon because of the size of their community and how much they do on the conference side and their webinar side. Although Azure's catching up, and their Azure Fridays are incredible. All right, price is another important metric for a lot of organizations for obvious reasons. I won't go into proving that out. Everybody understands why that would be important. So if you just wanted to run a small VM, a 1 gig of RAM with 30 gig storage, 1 core, on Amazon it's going to cost $16.18 for that month. 750 hours. Azure is going to be $17.85. I have this as an asterisk because this is where it gets a little harder. Azure VMs are 75% of the size of AWS, the equivalent VM. So this 1 gig, 30 gig, 1 gig of RAM, 30 gig of storage on Azure is 0.75 gigs of RAM, and I did 30 gigs of storage. But what I did is I multiplied the price by 1.3 to kind of normalize the price of what you get as far as the RAM. So anyway, it's $17.85 normalized for Azure. But on the other hand, AWS bills their VMs by the hour. So if you run a VM for 61 minutes, that's 2 hours of billing. If you run that in Azure, you get 61 minutes of billing. So if you are spinning up machines and then powering them down, you'll save a lot more money with Azure doing it that way. To store 100 gigs of data on AWS, it's $3, and Azure is $2.40. So Azure's cheaper. Nice, To do a small SQL Server database as a service using RDS on Amazon would be about $20.31, and on Azure it's about $4.98. Apples to oranges here. With Azure, you're sharing a service with other users, sharing the database server with others, whereas with AWS, you are on your own VM, on your own isolated database. So you might get a little bit more performance on the AWS side, but you probably wouldn't notice on your regular run-of-the-mill small L apps. So but that's kind of what the pricing is there. To transcode an hour of high-def video, again, they bill differently, so it's just kind of hard to compare the two. AWS bills by the minute of video. Azure bills by the size of the artifact. But it's about $1.99 versus $1.80. There are cases where Azure's cheaper. And then a 25 gig NoSQL database. So I'm comparing DynamoDB to Azure's DocumentDB. and it's like 4 cents versus $220. But I will say this: Azure's pricing model for their document DB is incredibly complex, and I spent a lot of time in their pricing tool. It's a great pricing tool, but their pricing model for document DB is way too complex. So, but this is as accurate as I think I can make it. I did an hour, or I did a month of a 25 gig document DB database, and I tried to do 1 request per second on Azure, and that's the price I came up with on both. So you're gonna save a lot more money with Amazon because they have Amazon has these spot instances, and they also have where you can do a reserved instance. And so this is where I think AWS is going to shine. So like for example, on this, sorry to jump back here, but this is how you would do a spot instance. Let's say you wanted to run load tests against your servers, and you just didn't want to pay the on-demand price for a VM. There is a marketplace, and you can say, okay, I want to do 2 machines running Windows Server here, and I want this size of machine, a C3 large with 2 CPUs and 3.75 gigs, and I want the lowest price you can find in, and I don't really care where these servers run. If they run in, Japan, that's okay. And then you just make a bid. Here I'm bidding, 18.8 cents per hour. And you can actually, when you click pricing history, you can see kind of where they jump around. So this is a Linux Unix server, extra large M4. And in the last week, you can see how it fluctuates all over the map. And it's probably because there's some, company running, like in the US East 1B, you can see the price goes up to $2.52, but in US East 1E, it's like 4.6 cents. So there's this cool like market going on for virtual machine capacity, and they just don't have this in the Azure world. So if you are like going to run a lot of VMs and you're flexible, you're going to save a lot more money at with Amazon. So I'm going to give the edge here to Amazon because their on-demand compute costs are about 75% less, basically for the equivalent compute costs, and then because of the spot pricing and reserved instances. But Azure, again, can be cheaper for you based on storage. So blob storage is going to be cheaper, and then their SQL Server as a service offering is going to be probably more inexpensive when it comes to really small instances. And then the fact that Azure bills by the minute compared to the hour that AWS bills. So again, AWS gets the slight edge here, 8 to 7. All right, jumping into troubleshooting and metrics. When you're in the cloud, you don't have physical access to the machine, so you need to know what's going on. Why are things breaking? So this is important to me. AWS has a custom dashboard, centralized logging reports. They have error reports. You can set notifications and alerts. You can track how much CPU usage is going on. And then memory usage you can do, but it's a pain in the neck, but you can kind of do it. Azure does have a custom dashboard, but there's not a centralized logging. There's no centralized reports, really, to get all these errors. You're going to have to basically poke around in your subscription and just look at the different resources that you have and look at their metrics. You can set up alerts and notifications. You can track the CPU usage. And then tracking memory usage in Azure is slightly easier if you're using the right resources. So that's kind of nice. But you're going to want logging centralized, I think. So this is where AWS integrates their logging together with their different services. So here's one of our logs that we have. And it gave us some insights as to why stuff was breaking. I'm going to give the edge here to AWS, but I'm disappointed in both of them. You are really, if you're a power user, you're going to want to augment the troubleshooting and metrics with some other tool like New Relic, Azure Watch. You're going to probably want to set up Papertrail or Splunk or some other logging tools. You're just going to need more data. So don't think that you're going to just be content to sit there with what the cloud service providers offer you. So 6 goes to AWS, 5 for Azure here. And then uptime. Uptime's so important because you're losing money if you're down, and if it's out of your control, it becomes even more frustrating when you're down. we're going to just look at storage and compute, because those are the two main things. Everything else seems to follow from those two. But they have the same SLAs for both 99.95 and 99.9. But as far as downtime goes, AWS had 2.41 hours of downtime to Azure's 39.77. This is according to a 2015 CloudHarmony.com article. And then they did the same article on January 2016, comparing the 2015 downtime, 2.5 hours for AWS. Azure had 10.8 hours. So it's getting better. And then just the last 30 days, Azure seems to have improved quite a bit for 2016. AWS in the last 30 days has been down for 2.2 minutes, and Azure is 0 minutes. So, Azure's catching up, but AWS has a much, much better track record. Here is an outage. This is some 2014. This, if I remember correctly, this is the infamous November 14, 2014 outage. That this was my one of my first days on the job at IDF5, and it was it was bad because it's multi-region, and that is a huge no-no. You want to deploy your resources across several regions, just in case one region goes down, you still have, your site still up. But in this one, you can see virtual machines were out across almost all regions here, with the little purple or the pink exclamation points. So this is why Azure is going to get a bad grade from me. If we did this, if I was doing this talk a year ago, it probably would be 9 to like a 5 for Azure, but it's coming up significantly. So this might be the year when Azure has less downtime than Amazon. It's very possible. They've been doing a very good job this year. So let's see what happens. So we all want to know who the winner is. If you've been keeping score at home, let's first look at the different service or the different categories that I'm scoring on. The main deviations that you're going to find are in storage, where Amazon gets a 9, Azure gets a 6, and deployment, where Azure gets a 9 and AWS gets a 7. Security, where 9 for Amazon, 7 for Azure. And then in uptime, AWS gets a 9, Azure gets a 7. So tallying up the scores, it's 78 to 70. And so the winner to me overall would be AWS. But it depends on your situation. I'm not going to say that everybody should move to Amazon. That's not true. I'm not going to say everybody should move to Azure either. So let's just give you let's get the easy ones out of the way. So if you like DOS, if you enjoy typing / for your switches, and you really enjoy all the power that DOS gives you, and if you know who this guy is and you think of him fondly still, and if you stood in line to buy this, or if you run this browser as your default browser still in the age of Chrome, then you're a clear candidate for Azure. You should just use Azure. You're going to be happy, and it's going to be tailor-made for you. Let's say, on the other hand, that you write Microsoft, and instead of S, you write a $sign. Or if you know what the Halloween documents are and you still shudder to think about them, and you have rage, if you know who this guy is and you'd vote for him for president, or if you participated and are a veteran of these wars, then you're probably going to enjoy Amazon. Now, that isn't to say that you couldn't enjoy Azure as a Linux zealot. You could be a very happy Linux zealot in the Azure land. There is a lot of VM instances that you can run, and there's Microsoft even gives you a discount if you use Linux. So I'm not trying to paint the picture that you can't be a happy Linux guy over in Azure land. You can, and you can be a happy Microsoft guy in AWS land. But if this is how you're resonating, this is how you're wired, then you're probably going to be happier in AWS in this world. But all those aside, before I even get into the comparing the two, I will say this. If you are a candidate for Microsoft BizSpark, which is their startup program, you should pursue Azure. They have a really generous offering for startups. Basically, the rules are you have to be focused on developing software, you have to make less than $1 million in revenue, and you have less than 5 or less developers, then you're going to be a BizSpark candidate. And it's fairly easy to set up, and if you do, then you get basically 3 years of MSDN subscriptions with Visual Studio Ultimate. You get $150 in Azure credits every month for every developer you have. So that is an incredible value, and you should just run to Azure and do this yesterday. It is a great feature. Also, if you have an MSDN subscription yourself and you want to play around with it, Azure is a great place because you get those Azure credits. So there's a lot of benefits to having an MSDN subscription or a BizSpark relationship. Amazon has something similar. They have AWS Activate for startups, and basically it gives you support, and you get basically you get the free usage tier, which is open to anyone. Amazon does give you for a year, basically for anyone, whether you have an MSDN subscription or not, you can get access to Amazon and their free usage tier. You get a lot of stuff, and the value is about $250 for the first 2 months, and then it drops down to about $50 for the rest of the year. And then your bill goes up to, roughly $50 at the end. So another option to look at. Azure with an MSDN is you're going to get a lot more value than just AWS with just your free usage tier. So beyond that, though, if you value a broader offering with a longer track record, if you want to use whatever Netflix, Pinterest, Airbnb, Slack, Foursquare, and Spotify are using, you want to take advantage of that knowledge. If you want to deploy dozens and dozens of VMs and have fine-grained control over them, if you really want to wheel and deal on your VM prices in your spot instances and with reserved instances, and if you need to store thousands of files in blob storage and you want fine-grained control over their life cycle, then you should be in AWS. You're going to get a lot more value there. Candidates include on the AWS side, I would say Huddle is definitely a great candidate here. I think Mosaic, with what we're doing, great candidate here. There's other companies in the area. Just think of any startup that uses lots of VMs and they want to take advantage of a lot of storage abilities. They're going to thrive on the AWS side of things. On the Azure side, if most developers in your shop have MSDN subscriptions, if your shop uses Visual Studio Online, if you'd like to leverage Active Directory for a single sign-on for all users in org for just about any third-party app, that's a nice feature of Azure's Active Directory. If you want to set up a hybrid network between your on-premise and domain and your cloud domain, basically to make your Azure VMs look like they're on your network and vice versa. If you only need SQL Server or MySQL and you prefer to run it as a platform as a service, a PaaS, Azure is where you want to be. So great candidates here. I know Farm Credit would be a great candidate for this. A lot of Microsoft shops in the areas should probably be on the Azure side of things. So that's it. I hope I was informative. I hope this helps you out. Again, my name is Paul Oliver, and that's my Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I'd love to, answer questions if you're still on the fence and you're not sure which way you should go. Thank you for your time.